Heidegger's divine violence. If there is a proposition against which our entire reading is aimed, it is the notion that Heidegger abandoned his romantic infatuation with struggle and mythical political deeds and sacrifices in favor of a more gentle and receptive form of openness to the earth and sky, mortals and divinities. A subtitle to the present chapter could well have been, "Beware of Gentle Openness." What this means with regard to the three phases of Heidegger's thought is that there is a potential breakthrough towards another dimension in phase 2, which gets lost in phase 3. Where Heidegger erred most, his Nazi engagement, he came closest to truth. Far from resolving the inconsistencies of phase 2, phase 3 proposes a new paradigm which renders them invisible. In contrast to this assertion of the late green Gelassenheit Heidegger, one should therefore explore for new openings the very Heidegger of violence, political deeds, and sacrifices. At the level of textual analysis, Gregory Fried has already done a lot of spade work in his deep and pertinent reading of Heidegger's entire opus, through the interpretive lens of his reference to Heraclitus's polemos, struggle in German, Krieg, Kampf, or predominantly in Heidegger, Auseinandersetzung, from the latter's famous fragment 53. War is both father of all and king of all. It reveals the gods on the one hand and humans on the other, makes slaves on the one hand, the free on the other. As every interpreter of Heraclitus knows, this fragment is to be read as the inversion of the religious vision of the universe as generated and ruled by a divine potency. For someone like Hesiod, God, Zeus, the father and king of all is. If we replace Zeus with struggle, war, we get a totally different overall map of the universe, not a hierarchical whole whose local tensions and struggles are controlled by the paternal force of the overwhelming divine one, but the ongoing process of struggle itself as the ultimate reality, as the process out of which all entities, as well as their temporary order, emerge. It is not only that each stable identity of each entity is only temporary, that they all sooner or later disappear, disintegrate, return to the primordial chaos. Their temporary identity itself emerges through struggle. That is, stable identity is something one should gain through the ordeal of struggle. One asserts in confrontation with the others. Perhaps this sounds familiar. One could insist that it does. When Heidegger, in his reading of the fragment, insists on how the struggle meant there is originary struggle, for it allows those who struggle to originate as such in the first place. Do we not have here not so much the usual Heidegger avec Hitler, but rather the unexpected Heidegger avec Stalin? For Stalin also, nature and history are a great ongoing process of eternal struggle between the opposites. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that internal contradictions are inherent in all things and phenomena of nature, for they all have their negative and positive sides, a past and a future, something dying away and something developing, and that the struggle between these opposites, the struggle between the old and the new, between that which is dying away and that which is being born, between that which is disappearing and that which is developing, constitutes the internal content of the process of development, the internal content of the transformation of quantitative changes into qualitative changes. The dialectical method therefore holds that the process of development from the lower to the higher takes place not as a harmonious unfolding of phenomena, but as a disclosure of the contradictions inherent in things and phenomena, as a struggle of opposite tendencies which operate on the basis of these contradictions. Even the class struggle is already there in Heraclitus, in the guise of the struggle which makes slaves on the one hand, the free on the other. According to some sources, one of Heidegger's visitors in the last years of World War II was surprised to see on desk some books on Marxist philosophy. He replied that, since the Soviet Union was going to win the war, he was getting ready to play his role in a new society. Apocryphal or not, we can see the inner logic of this anecdote, which resides in the unexpected reverberation between the highest and the lowest, the terse poetic beauty and precision of Heraclitus's ancient wisdom, and the simple brutality of Stalin's dialectical materialist worldview. The other key Greek passage on violence to which Heidegger repeatedly returns is the famous chorus from Antigone on the uncanny, demonic character of man. In his reading of this chorus, in the Introduction to Metaphysics, Heidegger deploys the notion of ontological violence that pertains to every founding gesture of the new communal world of a people, accomplished by poets, thinkers, and statesmen. Violence is usually seen in terms of the domain in which concurring compromise and mutual assistance set the standard for Dasein, and accordingly all violence is necessarily deemed only a disturbance and an offense. The violent one, the creative one who sets forth into the unsaid, who breaks into the unthought, who compels what has never happened and makes appear what is unseen, this violent one stands at all times in daring. Therefore, the violence doer knows no kindness and conciliation in the ordinary sense, no appeasement and modification by success or prestige and by their confirmation. For such a one, disaster is the deepest and broadest yes to the overwhelming. Essential decision when it is carried out and when it resists the constantly pressing ensnarement in the everyday and the customary, has to use violence. This act of violence, this decided setting out upon the way to the being of beings, moves humanity out of the hominess of what is most directly nearby and what is usual. As such, the creator is Hypsipolis Apolis, Antigone, line 370. He stands outside and above polis and its ethos. He is unbound by any rules of morality, which are only a degenerative form of ethos. Only as such can he ground a new form of ethos, of communal being in a polis. Of course, what reverberates here is the topic of an illegal violence that founds the rule of the law itself, deployed at the same time in different forms by Walter Benjamin and Carl Schmitt. What accounts for the chilling character of these passages is that here, Heidegger does not merely provide a new variation on his standard rhetorical figure of inversion. The essence of violence has nothing to do with ontic violence, suffering, war, destruction, etc. The essence of violence resides in the violent character of the very imposition, founding, of the new mode of the essence, disclosure of communal being itself. Here, Heidegger, implicitly but clearly, reads this essential violence as something that grounds, or at least opens up the space for, the explosions of ontic violence themselves. Liberal critics of Heidegger like to dwell on these lines, emphasizing how, in suspending even minimal moral criteria, Heidegger legitimizes the most brutal ontic violence of the statesman-creator, and thus paves the way for his own Nazi engagement and support for Hitler, as such a statesman-creator who, standing outside and above the communal space of the moribund Weimar Republic, fearlessly shattered its coordinates and thus violently grounded a new communal being, that of the Germany reawakened in the National Socialist Revolution. However, what one is tempted to add here is that, in the case of Nazism and fascism in general, the constellation of violence is rather the opposite. Crazy, tasteless even, as it may sound, the problem with Hitler was that he was not violent enough, that his violence was not essential enough. Nazism was not radical enough. It did not dare to disturb the basic structure of the modern capitalist social space, which is why it had to focus on destroying an invented external enemy, Jews. This is why one should oppose the fascination with Hitler, which claims that, of course, he was an evil man responsible for the deaths of millions, but that he definitely had courage, that he pursued what he wanted with an iron will. The point is that this is not only ethically repulsive, but simply wrong. No, Hitler did not have the courage to really change things. He did not really act. All his actions were fundamentally reactions. That is, he acted so that nothing would really change. He staged a great spectacle of revolution so that the capitalist order would survive. If one really wants to come up with an act which was truly daring, for which one truly had to have the courage to try the impossible, but which was simultaneously a horrific act, an act which caused suffering beyond comprehension, one could nominate Stalin's forced collectivization at the end of the 1920s in the Soviet Union. But even here, the same reproach holds. The paradox of the 1928 Stalinist revolution was rather that, in all its brutal radicality, it was not radical enough, in effectively transforming the social substance. Its brutal destructiveness has to be read as an impotent passage à l'acte, far from simply standing for a total forcing of the unnameable real on behalf of the truth. Stalinist totalitarianism rather designates the attitude of absolutely ruthless pragmatism, of manipulating and sacrificing all principles on behalf of maintaining power. From this perspective, the irony of Hitler was that his grand gestures of despising bourgeois self-complacency and so on were ultimately in the service of enabling this complacency to continue. Far from effectively disturbing the much disparaged, decadent bourgeois order, far from awakening the Germans from immersion in its degeneracy, Nazism was a dream which enabled them to continue wallowing in it and to postpone an awakening. Germany really awakened only in the defeat of 1945. The worry that Badiou's notion of courage, which one needs in order to practice the fidelity to the event, raises in liberal minds is, but how are we to distinguish good, properly evental courage from bad courage? Say, were the Nazis who defended Berlin in the winter of 1944-45, or the Muslim terrorists who blow themselves up when they perform suicidal attacks, also not truly courageous? One should nonetheless insist that there is no bad courage. Bad courage is always a form of cowardice. The courage of the Nazis was sustained by their cowardice concerning attacking the key feature of their society, the capitalist relations of production. The courage of the terrorists relies on the big other, whose instruments they perceive themselves to be. The true courage of an act is always the courage to accept the inexistence of the big other. That is, to attack the existing order at the point of its symptomal knot. Back once more to Heidegger. What this means is that Hitler's violence, even at its most terrifying, the murder of millions of Jews, was all too ontic. That is, it too was an impotent passage à l'acte that revealed the inability of the Nazi movement to be really apolis, to question, confront, shatter the basic coordinates of bourgeois communal being. And what if Heidegger's own Nazi engagement is also to be read as a passage à l'acte, a violent outburst that bears witness to Heidegger's inability to resolve the theoretical deadlock he found himself in? The question of how Heidegger's Nazi commitment relates to his philosophy should thus be recast. It is no longer a question of adequatio, correspondence, between Heidegger's thought and his political acts, but an inherent theoretical deadlock, which in itself has nothing to do with Nazism, and the violent passage as the only way of escaping it. This is how one should also reframe the old dilemma. Which was in the beginning the word or the act? Logically, it all began with the word. The act that followed was a flailing outburst that bore witness to the deadlock of the word. And the same goes for the act par excellence, the divine act of creation. It also signals the impasse of God's ratiocinations. In short, here, too, the negative aspect of ontological proof holds. The fact that God created the world does not display his omnipotence and excess of goodness, but rather his debilitating limitations.